This is Chris from Amateur Traveler, and this is the second bonus episode in what I'm calling the More Travel series. So these are not our usual Amateur Traveler episodes. If you're looking for a destination to go to, then come back on Saturdays when those episodes will come out. We're going to continue to do that, and these midweek episodes will be special episodes, and this one is about living abroad. So stay tuned if that's something you think you'd be interested in. I would like to welcome back to the show Justin Barnes. And Justin has been on numerous times talking about various destinations, but this is not one of those kind of episodes. This episode is one of those bonus episodes where we talk about topics. And Justin, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back.
And you live part of the time out of the country. When I say the country, the US, you have a residence, a home in a lovely part of Spain. And when I say part of Spain, the Canaries.
Yes. Yeah, we live here a little bit over probably 2/3 of the year here.
And one of the big questions that came up when I said, what topics do people want to know was, how do I live abroad? And I assume that is a very simple process.
It can be as simple or as complicated as you want. And it really depends on who you are and how short a period of time you're willing to live anywhere. Let me just give you a quick example. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of places with a US passport that you can live for 90 days without needing a visa, without needing
Right.
anything other than your passport. So if you wanted to get an idea of, hey, I would really like to live, let's say, in Tuscany, for example, you can go live in Tuscany for 89 days and get an idea of whether you like it there. And if you do, then start the process to go back. If you're already a little further along and you've got your heart set on living somewhere and you want to be there for more than 90 days, then it becomes obviously more complicated because you'll need either a visa, which come in a couple different flavors, or depending on what your bloodline is like and how far you can trace it back, you theoretically could become a citizen in a number of countries. I know that there's pretty well established programs with, for example, Ireland has one, Italy has one. There's a couple more, but those are the ones I hear the most frequently.
Yeah, I think
Um,
Poland has one because my German ancestors came from what is now Poland, but none of those worked for me because they had to be parents or grandparents had to have come from there, not great grandparents or something like that.
Yeah, sometimes it's limited to a certain number of generations. Other
Right.
times it's limited to just your father's side of the family. And so there's any
Huh.
number of hoops that you might have to jump through depending on the country. But if you are thinking about moving abroad and you do have relatives from outside the country, at least start there because that process, at least in theory, can be a little bit more straightforward. And obviously, being a citizen somewhere affords you a lot more rights than just holding a visa.
Right. And then there's also buying property, which gets more complicated. So
Yes.
we're going to put that a little further down. When you were thinking about where you wanted to live abroad, did you just stumble across a place and say, I want to live here? Or did you say, I want to live part of the time outside the US and then look for places?
Yeah, so actually, it was just a spur of the moment back, what was it, about 7 years ago? We were just walking around in Istanbul, and it was our second visit to Istanbul, and it's a lovely city. And all of a sudden, my wife just said, you know what? I think we should try to live out in the country at some time. And it wasn't necessarily specific to Istanbul, but obviously, Istanbul was what prompted this. And then we started to look at things a little bit more seriously. And by 2.5 years later, we had narrowed it down to four places we were thinking of living. One was here in the Canary Islands, one was in Barcelona, one was in Budapest in Hungary, and the other was Vienna, Austria. And so what we did is we took a trip where we visited all four of those places back to back to back and did our best compare and contrast in terms of did these cities have the things we were looking for? If they didn't, what was the closest end around? Compared prices, compared weather, compared various sorts of things to get an idea of, okay, which of these is probably the most realistic and which are we the most excited about? And perhaps because we did that trip in December as opposed to May, the Canary Islands came out at the top of the list, at least
Sure.
then.
And did you take into account at that point how easy it was going to get into all of those countries? There's long-term stay, there's permanent resident, there's citizenship.
Yeah.
You were looking at a long-term stay at this point.
Yeah, and to be frank, we didn't really look that closely comparing and contrasting. I guess that would have been Spain, Hungary, and Austria, only because I assumed, perhaps incorrectly, that they would be all fairly similar because I just had this thought in my head that most of the
EU
red tape
countries.
for becoming into the EU or one of
Mhm.
the EU countries is going to be fairly similar to the others because otherwise it would just create a loophole where somebody could get into, let's say, one
Right.
of the, I think it's 26 countries, and then once there, easily migrate to the other 25. And I don't think the other 25 would be particularly happy about that. So I just assumed that they were all fairly comparable in terms of the red tape.
Okay. So you said, "Hey, we want to live in the Canary Islands." You don't just buy plane tickets at that point and
No.
move to the Canary. So what are the steps?
Yeah, so we looked at the various visas, and you had
Yep.
mentioned one of them, which was an investment visa, which several countries have, several don't, and some that have it are phasing out. But I can come back to that.
And I see those more in developing countries than I see them in European countries.
Yeah, and I don't want to get off on a tangent, but I think it goes back to what I was talking about a minute ago. I think there's pressure from some of the EU countries to some of the other EU countries to stop making it so quote unquote easy for rich people to get in, rich
Yeah.
people who they might not want in, who might have ties to something illicit. I don't know.
Might be
Everyone can use their
oligarchs at
imagination.
this point. Yeah.
Your words, not mine, but yes. Yeah, so we looked at what was going into getting a retirement visa, which is basically it's designed for people who are retired and are collecting like a pension from their job or social security or getting minimum distributions from their 401k or IRA, something where they're getting a check every month and that check is of a sufficient size that they can then go to the country that they want to go to and say, hey, we have enough money to support ourselves. We're not going to be destitute. We're not going to be living
And we're
off
not
of
taking
the
any jobs away from anybody
exactly.
else. Yeah.
And to that point, I would assume, I know at least for Spain, it would not surprise me if for most of the other countries, at least in Europe, which again, I realize we're talking about generally, but my information unfortunately is limited mostly to Europe. Most of the time, you can't work if you have a retirement visa because they don't want you coming here and
Right.
then all of a sudden becoming a bartender and taking a bartending job from a local person.
Sure.
So, yeah, so retirement visa is probably the most common way that you would get to live somewhere abroad. And for that, you have to show sufficient savings. You have to show a background check, basically, that you don't have a criminal record. You have to fill out a bunch of forms. You have to get them apostilled, which I'll come back to that in a minute. You have to get them translated, and then you send everything off to the consulate for the country. Depending on how you do it, that could be online, or you might have to go to the consular office closest to where you live, which for some people may be quite far from where they live.
The other thing that I hear with Spain and with some of the other European countries that other people are using, Estonia, I know, if they're still in working years, if their job is such that it is a remote job and they can work remotely, the digital nomad visa variety, which again is I'm coming to your country, I'm bringing money, I'm not taking jobs, which is what really all countries are thinking about in terms of do I want this person here? Are they a desirable? Are they undesirable? Are they a net positive for the country? And so I know that is an option that I've known people who are taking as well, who are a few years younger or a few years less successful, at least
Right.
than you were.
So there's two things there. One is some countries do have what's specifically titled a nomad visa or digital nomad visa. It's for
Right.
people who are self-employed. Think of, I don't know, an influencer for one example. Another
Sure.
example would be somebody who has their own business doing travel podcasts, for example. For that's one option, and it really varies from country to country. And
Right.
even the way that's is different because some countries have more beneficial digital nomad visas than others. I'll just give you an
Right.
example of what might be more beneficial. I know when Spain rolled out theirs, let's say 2 years ago or something like that, it was met with some derision because all of the people on the digital nomad visa were still going to have to pay taxes in Spain, whereas a lot of the
Ah,
other digital nomad visas, you would only owe taxes in the country where you decided to have your tax residence be, which could be the US, but it could be some Caribbean country that doesn't have any taxes or has very low taxes.
right.
So,
And the other issue
um,
there is it might be double taxes. It might be if you're a US influencer or say travel podcaster that you're still paying US taxes and then also Spanish taxes.
yeah, I've looked at that, and for the most part, I don't want to say there's with 100% certainty, but almost every country has a double taxation agreement with the US. So that if, let's say, let's just make the math real simple. Let's say that you made $100,000 a year
Yep.
and your US tax rate was 30% because of that, and you moved somewhere that had a 40% tax rate, you would owe $30,000 to the US and then use that $30,000 as a credit against the 40,000 that you would owe in your European country, and you would pay them just 10. So
Yep.
you don't actually pay double taxation, but what you do is pay whichever is higher.
Yep.
So
Okay. We should say that this is not official tax
no,
advice nor legal advice. Justin
no,
was a lawyer here, but do
not that kind of lawyer.
yeah, do seek out more detailed information as you go further along in your process. Yeah.
One thing, I met with a tax person here a couple of weeks ago because I had a bunch of questions because this year, this calendar year, we're going to owe taxes, I don't know, springtime next year. And I was just trying to get an idea
Yep.
for here of what might be applicable. And it was what I thought, that basically you pay taxes in both places, but one of them is used as an offset against the other.
Got it. Okay, that's good to
Uh,
know.
but going back to what you mentioned about the nomad visa, there's one other type of visa that might apply to people who have very good jobs or very unique jobs with companies that really like them. You
Right.
can get a work visa where your
Hmm.
employer actually sponsors you and they work with you to say, hey, Chris is a really good employee. He's got this special skill that we don't want to lose. He
Right.
wants to move to south of France. And so France, we would like him to be there on a work visa, and potentially that is a way to make things a little easier as well, because then your company is helping and it's goes through a different process with different people looking at it. So there are a number of different visas available: your retirement type visa,
Right.
your nomad visa, your work visa, and then your visa by investment, which usually means purchasing a home, but it doesn't have to be a home. It can be investing in,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
a real estate project, or directly investing in a bank owned by that country, not just any bank. But if you wanted to move to Spain, you would invest like in a Spanish bank or something like that.
And I assume, I know it's true in the US, I assume there's also some category if you just happen to be a Nobel Prize winner or some exceptional
Yes.
person, you may get a different visa, but that is not available to all of us, let's just say.
Now, I'm not a footballer, but yeah, that's being a world class footballer is one way to get a work visa as well.
Good to know. So I've got my visa. I figured that out some fashion. What process did you use, first of all, for figuring that out? Just a lot of Googling on the internet, or are there
Yeah, so I
experts?
was going through this process. There's both. I was going through this process for the first time in the year 2020, and we were seeking a retirement visa. I had a lot of time on my hands. I wasn't going anywhere. So I looked at all of it and I read a number of things online about what was required and the process. And once I had read enough things and seen more or less the same answers and the same flow chart, so to speak, from
Right.
a number of different things, I felt sufficiently confident that I could do it myself and gathered all the paperwork. So I'm not going to remember everything here, but I know at the very least we had to fill out an application. We had to fill out what's called a letter of intent, which is basically why do we want to move
Okay.
to where we wanted to move. I think that's fairly common from country to country. We had to get a background check done. That's either done by the state, in my case, it was the state of California, or by the Department of Justice in DC. We had to show our marriage certificate.
Konnichiwa, I'm Yuki, a tour leader with Explore. Who knew that hidden among Tokyo's towering skyscrapers It was a peaceful tea house, surrounded by ancient trees and serene ponds. Actually, I knew. It was my mother's secret sanctuary. Not everyone knows about Tokyo's Hamarikyu Gardens. ありがとうございます. But you will if you explore. Search exploreworldwide.com. And don't just travel, explore.
And we had to show proof of health insurance
Okay.
because once again, the country doesn't want to be taking care of you. So we need to basically have already purchased healthcare insurance that was already in effect by the time we applied for our visa, which then meant
Huh.
our, our insurance was going to run out way before the visa was in terms of what was going to get renewed first. It's a chicken or egg thing, and I can appreciate why they want the insurance to actually
Sure.
be in effect before the application process is done. So once you get all of that paperwork in order, the first thing you need to do for some of the documents is you need to get them apostilled, which is a word I had not heard before. Apostile. And it's somewhat like getting something notarized, but not really. Let's say you have a
Okay.
marriage certificate from the county of Alameda. Some bureaucrat sitting in Madrid is going to have no idea what the county of Alameda is, and is going to have no idea whether the marriage certificate that he or she is looking at is a valid marriage certificate from
Huh.
the county of Alameda. So, what you do with your marriage certificate and also with your background check, and I think there might have been one or two other things, is you have to go to an office. In my case, it was in Los Angeles. I think there might be one in Sacramento as well. And I think those are the only two in California. For other states, I don't know, but I get the impression this is not something that's going to be in every single city, probably just the very largest ones or the capital. And you go there with your documents, and then they basically put a stamp and a cover sheet on it saying this is from the state of California. This is a true and correct copy of a marriage certificate from
Hmm.
such and such date in this county. This is a true and correct certificate of a background check that was performed in March of 2020, that sort of thing. And once you have everything apostilled, then you take all the documents and get them translated into whatever the language is of where you're going. So in our case, it was Spanish. If you were applying to
Hmm.
France, I assume you'd have to get it translated in French, et cetera, et cetera. There are some countries where perhaps you might be able to avoid that because there are certain countries that use English a ton. And so maybe there's a handful. I'm just
Right.
going off the cuff here, maybe Germany or Belgium or something like that. You might be able to get away with having everything in English, but in Spain, we needed to have everything translated and it needed to be translated by an official translator. That was actually one of the easier parts of the process because there's a lot of people who do that. It's easy to find them online. You can send them a lot of the stuff over the web or over Dropbox or something like
Okay.
that, and they'll send it back. And then once we had everything, we had the original documents in English, we had the official translations, we had the apostilles. We put everything, I think, in a big FedEx folder and either physically took it to the Spanish consulate in Los Angeles or sent it to the Spanish consulate in Los Angeles. I can't remember which one it was. I'm guessing we sent it because this would have been during COVID and they probably didn't want anyone coming in there. So there's a chance that you send everything away and it's all good and you just get your literal and figurative rubber stamp. In our case, there were certain things that were missing and we had a certain amount of time to rectify it. One of them was in our specific case, they weren't happy with the medical insurance we had because it didn't explicitly cover COVID. And obviously in 2020,
Yeah.
they were worried about this. So we had to
Right.
quickly find a different health insurance that explicitly covered COVID. And then the other thing with our letter of intent, they wanted us to explicitly state that we would not work when we were in Spain. Now,
Okay.
at the time, we were on one of those retirement visas. That's what we were applying for. We were basically just live off our savings, and we had sufficient savings to do that. And we had seen online, it was the one thing that there wasn't really a clear answer on. It was ambiguous whether if you did have a job that you could do completely remotely, or if you were self-employed where you weren't going to be taking a quote unquote local job,
Right.
it was ambiguous to us whether you could work. And we hadn't made up our mind on whether we wanted to work or not. So we hadn't stated anything one way or the other. But they said, no, you need to state unambiguously you won't work. So
Hmm.
that made up
On
our
that
then.
visa. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So then we sent all that away. We did get everything approved. And then that led to the next part, which is trying to set up the move, which is as logistically difficult or simple as you want to make it. In our case, we had two dogs, one of which had just had major surgery. So for us, it was very logistically difficult, not only because they're dogs, not only because one had had surgery, not only because they were bulldogs, which meant fewer airlines wanted to fly them.
Right.
We're doing this in the middle of COVID when there's 10% of the international flights that there would normally be. So just trying to find any routing that worked was very difficult. If it was just my wife and I, the move would have been very straightforward because we weren't going to bring a ton of stuff with us. I think we just brought basically, I think I brought 3 bags and she brought 2, just whatever we were allowed on United or Lufthansa or whatever it was, Lufthansa. But some people want to ship a ton of stuff over
Right.
in cargo things. A bunch of people are moving over with kids that obviously you have issues with having to arrange for schooling and that sort of thing. And you may be limited in the time of year that you can actually. What happened was we got a visa that was good for 90 days. And then what was supposed to happen was once we arrived in Spain and actually got situated in our home in a specific city, had gone to basically the town hall, so to speak, and said, hey, I'm Justin. This is my wife. We're here. We're living here. Put us down on the list of everyone who lives in town. Then you go back to the visa office and you say, hey, so you gave us this visa to live here. We actually do live here now. We've arrived. This is where we're living. This is our phone number. This is how you can find us. That was supposed to be the easy part of the process. For us, it was not. We
Hmm.
did the difficult process and it was difficult, but it wasn't impossible. But then the very easy part for us was not so easy, mainly because we arrived in January of 2021 to an island with tens of thousands of people from Britain, and Brexit had just taken effect 1 week earlier. And you had a bunch of
Ah.
British people who had never needed a visa to be in Spain. And now tens of thousands of them needed a visa to be in Spain. And they all applied for their visas basically in January of 2021. And our renewal application basically just got stuck in a huge pile. So we had problems because of that. But I think that was a rather unique situation in terms of timing, location, etc. Generally, that seems to be a non-event.
Hmm.
So I will say we are back, but with a different visa this time. The investment visa is what we used this time around, and we bought a house. And that process, while not straightforward, was more straightforward than the last time. And this time we enlisted the help of a local person who was well versed in dealing with all the bureaucracy, knowing exactly what needs to look like what needs to be perfect, what can be less than perfect, what qualifies for this, what qualifies for that. And it was a godsend. And frankly, I would recommend that most people find a local person on the ground, preferably as close to where they plan to live so that they can physically interact with whoever's going to be helping them. I had assumed because I was an attorney and I was used to dealing with this sort of stuff that I'd be able to maneuver through all this. And maybe if I was trying to do it in the US, that would have been just fine. But looking back on it, just think of when you're having trouble trying to do something at the DMV. Now imagine the DMV is in a different country, speaking a different language. You've just made a difficult problem 10 to
Yeah.
100 times more difficult, and you have no idea what any of the customs or ways of doing business are there. So I would very much recommend that you find somebody on the ground who can help with these sort of things. And in that regard, one of the things that we did months before we ever arrived was I just joined a couple of the Facebook groups for expats on the island or
Okay.
residents in the part of the island that we were going to be moving to, and just kept an eye on who's saying what about what's new in town, Why isn't the pool open? Is anyone having problems with getting their property tax bill paid? Random
Right.
things that you
Right.
see. And eventually you start to see, okay, about a half dozen people have had problems getting their visa approved because they're not getting the okay on the XYZ document. And then you'll see somebody say, oh, for the XYZ document to be accepted, it needs to specifically say ABC. And then you realize, okay, this person, whoever they are, seems to know what they're talking about. And you can look at them and realize, oh, they've given a lot of good advice to a lot of people over a long period of time.
Yeah.
Maybe this would be somebody that would be good to help me with my specific problem because they seem to be knowledgeable about all the things which I
Interesting.
am not.
And I assume the process of looking at houses is probably fairly similar as it was at home, but the process of buying a property, uh, I would assume, is a different thing.
Yes,
Because
and
I know
that
even
again,
state to state in the U.S., it can be very different. In this state, you use a realtor. In this state, you have to finish that with an attorney. And I have no
yeah.
idea what it's like in Spain.
In our case, the one thing I was not expecting was that a notary is very involved, and a notary does way, way more stuff than a notary does
Not just the
in
last
the
day where
U.S.
you sit down in front of the notary.
It is the last day in front of the notary, but they're basically doing the job of basically a bureaucrat and a lawyer and a notary all
Hmm,
at one time.
interesting.
And there's a very small and select number of them. So you need to make nice with them. But some countries allow you to purchase properties foreigners, some don't. So
Right. Yeah.
obviously the countries that allow visa by investment obviously allow non-residents to buy
Right.
property. Otherwise, it would be an impossibility. And one thing that's interesting is a lot of the countries have a specific price limit or price floor, I should say, for what qualifies to get
Oh,
your
interesting.
visa.
Okay.
And one thing that we were not expecting was you can't just have, in our case, both of us together purchase the property because if, let's say, the limit was 500,000 and there were two owners and we basically each owned $250,000 worth of it, then neither one of us met the limit.
Huh.
Whereas if you have one person buy the property and then the other person basically be their plus one, then that works. Hopefully,
Okay.
everyone thinking of doing this, make sure you're on very good terms with your partner.
I find that's a good rule for life in general, but yeah.
Yeah, good
Okay.
advice generally. Yes, yeah.
Now, one thing I'm curious about, so some places, even within a specific country, are very open and very welcoming for someone coming in from outside, not just culturally, but administratively. I think of the little towns in Italy that are looking for people to buy up the old houses and fix them up, and where they're reaching out and saying, you can buy a house for €1 or something like that. You happen to have moved to some place where a lot of people want to be, and there's been some pushback about expats.
Yeah. I haven't seen too much of that because the island where I live is a lot like the Hawaiian Islands in that there's one side that's more local and one side more touristy.
Oh,
And we
okay.
live on the more local side. So we don't see a fraction of the tourists that are on the other side of the island. The other side of the island, there's large swaths of it that you really think you might be walking around in London or something like that.
Okay.
Um, Here, everyone seems quite welcoming and happy to see us. I don't know if we're treated any better, worse, or the same than local people. Occasionally, we'll see spray painted walls that say "Euros go home" or "Expats go home," but that's really very few and far between. And I walk all over the town, so I haven't seen much of any of that. I would say generally, in response to your question, if you want to move somewhere that is more touristy, where there are a lot of
Right.
tourists, where there are a lot of expats, you're going to be met with a lot more uh, sideways glances because it's not that the people don't like the tourists and the expats personally. It's the fact that when so many people move to an area or visit an area, let alone both,
Right.
it really drives up the housing prices
Right.
for everyone that's there. And eventually the locals can't even afford to live where they used to live. When entire towns get taken over by expats and tourists and Airbnbs. Whereas some of those places you mentioned in Italy, like Tuscany, that,
that are
the Tuscan
depopulating. Yeah.
hillside, yeah, they're depopulating. Yeah, they'd be ecstatic to have people there because they want the people slash need the people. So yeah, I think it really boils down to, are you moving to an area that's very popular and getting increasingly, or are you somewhere that is steady state, or are you somewhere that's depopulating? And depending where you are on that spectrum, I think that's really going to impact how happy or not happy people are going to be to see and move in.
And I'm trying to remember some of the questions that we had, specific questions from some of the community, and whether we have addressed them or not.
One of them had to do with costs. What was more expensive? What was less expensive? One of the main reasons we moved is the cost of medical care. What we pay for a year for the is about what we would pay for 1 month in the United States.
Hmm.
And that's even before you get to things like copays and having to pay a percentage of what you get done. Here, basically, because most of the hospitals are not really set up to really deal with insurance payments, because 98, 99% of the
Right.
people are on the country's healthcare plan. Um, Most, if not all, of the insurance that's done for people not on that is no copay, no deductible,
Hmm.
meaning you're basically paying all in. And then when you go to the hospital, theoretically, you just walk out without paying anything. I've gone to the hospital between 2021 and 2024 maybe 3 or 4 times, and I've never had to pay anything, including for a CAT scan. So that was quite a surprise and quite a nice one. So I would say, yeah, the medical care is way cheaper, maybe about a tenth of the price. And that's even before you get to things like prescription drugs, that some of which you don't even need a prescription here for. And even some of the ones where you do need a prescription, what you pay would be a fraction of what you would pay in the US. So the medical care, I think, it's fair to say it's going to be pretty much cheaper everywhere. Now, the flip side of that is, when we return to the US, we actually have to get travel health insurance because, God forbid, anything happened to us while we're on US soil
Hmm.
and we need to go into a hospital in the US. Our Spanish health insurance is of no use there.
Right.
And we would have to pay completely out of pocket. And the last thing I want to do is paying out of pocket at a US hospital. So,
That's the last thing a lot of us want to do. But besides
so
being in a U.S. hospital, or any hospital for that matter.
yes, yeah. So we have to buy what's called travel health insurance,
Hmm.
which is fairly prevalent because a lot of people have, let's say, family members who come visit them for months on end to watch the grandkids or something like that. You basically buy it for the length of your trip.
Hmm.
It's like travel insurance, but just for health related stuff. And it's not too pricey. It's maybe, I don't know, $10 a day or something like that. I don't know the exact number,
Okay.
but it's nothing too outrageous. Um, Going back to the general question about costs, groceries seem to be about a wash. Some stuff is more, some stuff is less. I just assume
And that's
based on
obviously going to depend on where you are. Yeah.
yeah, especially for fruits and veggies and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
I would say the rent here is much less than California and Hawaii, which are the two places where I lived in the US.
Right.
But I would say most places, in
Right.
fact, almost everywhere is much less than California and Hawaii. So I'm not sure how helpful that is. I would say veterinary care is much less, maybe a half of what we paid in the US, maybe
Hmm.
less than that. And then transportation, which is a bigger subject that we can get back to, but I'm going to talk about it just cost wise, is it's free for us because residents here can take the bus and the trams for free if they use it frequently enough, which we do. So we don't have a car, we don't pay any car insurance, and we walk and take the bus everywhere. So basically, we have zero cost for gas, car
Hmm.
insurance, etc. If you live somewhere, and there's a lot of places in Europe and then also larger cities in South America, for example, I'm just thinking of like Buenos Aires or
Right.
Santiago or something like that, have pretty good or at least passable subways, metros, etc. there's a lot of places outside the US where you can get around just with your feet, a bike, and mass transit. So that could theoretically be quite a bit of cost savings. If you do need a car, I think the gas prices are roughly comparable to the US, certainly within
Oh, really? Because
50%.
usually I'm used to Europe being significantly more for gas than the US.
Again, this could be because I was living in Southern California and it doesn't have the cheapest gas. So it's probably a lot more than, let's say, New Jersey or Iowa. But I
So
think it was
California is
some,
usually a a buck more, maybe $1.50 more than say New Jersey is what I'm used to. But I remember driving up to the trick in Europe is you've got to do your conversions, right? Because you see the prices in euros per liter and 3.8 liters per gallon. But I'm thinking that I paid as much as $7 a gallon for gas in Europe before. And
I
I've
think here
never
right now
even
it's
seen
about
that.
five,
Oh,
roughly.
five is
I
about
don't
what
look
we're
too
paying. Yeah.
closely, but okay.
We're down now into the high threes in California, so other people are
Okay.
probably paying 50 cents.
Yeah, yeah. So transportation generally is something that, is worth checking out because that affects not only where you might want to live,
Right.
generally speaking, but then even more specifically, let's say you've decided that you want to live in Rome. Maybe there's certain neighborhoods of Rome where you would want to be much closer to one of the metro stops or one of the train stations or something like that. Um, we live in an area where before we bought the property, I actually took the bus several times because I wanted to make sure, okay, is this thing roughly on time? How
Sure.
frequent is it? That sort of thing. And we live just outside the town. We can walk to it in maybe 30 or 40 minutes, and it's maybe like an 8 to 10 minute ride on the bus. Um, but it's like only one bus line that comes by. If that's a situation that you find yourself in, you have to ask yourself, okay, so I'm tethered to this one line, whether it
Right.
be on the metro or the bus or the tram or whatever. How late does it run? Am
Right.
I going to turn into a pumpkin every Friday at 10 p.m.? In our case, worst case, we get a cab and it's five euros or something like that. But we also know we can catch buses till I think 12:30 or something on most nights of the week. So these are all things to like think of ahead of time. I know I told you at the very beginning of this that we took the trip where we went to four different places and checked out different things. So things we looked at were the prices of bell peppers, prices of raspberries, the prices of
Okay.
rum. Were there a bunch of veterinary offices around? How easy was it to hail a cab? Like sorts of things that if you get the wrong answer, that could potentially be disqualifying for you in your specific scenario.
Now, is it the rum or the peppers that would have been more disqualifying in your case?
What was actually the one disqualifying thing that it turns out closed between when we decided to move to Puerto and when we actually did move to Puerto was there any Mexican restaurants?
Ah, okay.
There was one, and then it moved, and that was a major bummer. But yeah, so if there's certain things that you're really used to, if there's something that you've had for breakfast every day for the last 20
Right.
years, go to the grocery store and see if they have it. They might not, right?
I mean, you could cook Mexican food if you can get the ingredients. If they don't have Mexican restaurants, they may not have anything like the ingredients. Yep.
Yeah.
And
Like
one
for
thing I'm
example, I
curious
had
about,
to. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I actually every time I come back from the U.S., I pack as much granola as I can in my bag because there's one brand that I've been eating for several years, and
Sure.
I can't find it here. It's bring my own or find something else, and I haven't found anything else that is comparable yet. Certain people have their brand of coffee or something like that. So really, if there's something that you really have fixed in your head that this is, I could live without it, but I really don't want to live without it, check to see if it's around before you pull the trigger.
Here's a little more personal question, and you can tell me it's not something you want to answer. Are you thinking you're a long-term resident in Spain? This is where they'll bury you. Is this someplace that is a phase that you think you want to live here for a while and then maybe try someplace else? I assume you've thought about this. I don't even know if you've reached any conclusions on this.
Well, it's interesting. We get asked that question a lot, and I never quite know how to answer it because people move all the time. I have friends
Right.
who just moved from San Diego to Denver, and I never thought to ask them, how long are you going to live in Denver? Right? That's
Right.
not, but when you move outside the country, all of a sudden you do get asked that question. We don't have an answer.
So it wasn't part of the plan, for instance, if we want to live abroad for 5, 10 years. It was we want to live abroad and then we'll see.
And part of that could be because we started the process, went through the process, and basically failed the process 3 years ago. So we didn't want to put the cart before the horse
Sure.
second time around. As long as they have us here, we're happy to be here. Right now, our visa, I think, is good for 3 years. And assuming we still own the property and assuming we still have a clean criminal record, I think it's basically a very straightforward process to get it extended for another 2 years and then another 2 years and another 2 years.
Hmm.
And at some point, we'll have lived here enough years that I think we could apply for permanent residency and then potentially for citizenship. But that depends on a number of things because going back to what you were saying about taxes earlier, one thing that to keep in mind and one thing to consider if you're thinking about living abroad, but maybe you also want to keep one foot in the US is you only have to pay taxes abroad, at least in Spain. Maybe the same in other countries may not, but I think this sort of generally applies in a lot of countries. Is if you don't reside there for more than 182 days,
Right.
you don't have to pay taxes there. Um, but if you don't pay taxes there because you lived there only 182 days, then you don't get credit for that year as being a year towards making the goal of permanent residency
Oh,
or
interesting.
citizenship.
Okay.
In other words, you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Sure. That's
At some point, we'll need to decide, okay, do we actually want to make this like our primary residence and pay taxes here every year and try to get 10 years for permanent residency or citizenship or whatever? But we're not that far along in the process. We still own our home in Hawaii, and we've visited there frequently. We can't visit there as frequently as we want because it's a whole hassle to move pets back and forth across the
right.
globe. So we're not doing that. But depending on how you want to do it, you could try and keep one foot in multiple countries.
Okay.
But if you do want to move abroad, depending on what sort of visa you get, oftentimes they're for a year or two and renewable for a year or two. And maybe you just decide along the line, hey, this is way more awesome than I ever thought it would be. And I want to make a full change and sell everything I have in the US and not be a
Right.
tax resident there anymore. Or you may decide, oh, it's not for me, or oh, that was nice for 5 years, but now I've got relatives who are getting old who I want to be closer to. It's really going to vary for every person. And at least right now, I don't have a fixed answer.
As we start to wrap this up, thinking along those lines, the day where you said, I am so glad we did this.
It was the day that I flew out in 2021. The day I moved outside of the US to, I actually wasn't even in Spain yet. I landed in Germany and turned on my phone and looked at my phone in shock and horror for about 20 minutes and said, I guess I picked the right day to get out. I flew out on January 6th, 2021.
Holy crap. Okay. Huh.
So everything happened while I was on a plane with no internet access.
Okay. And then the day that you had second thoughts and came closest to packing your bags and moving back to the
Uh,
US.
we did pack our bags and move back. And what it was in our specific scenario, we were just not getting anywhere with the process. We felt like we were just lost with everything that was going on. At that time, we had a different attorney that we were working with, solicitor, I think might be the specific name. And I felt like he wasn't being very effective at what he was doing in terms of expediting the process because at the time we couldn't, our visa had expired. We weren't illegal because we had applied for the
Right.
extension and we were just waiting on the government to do what they needed to do. But because it had expired, we couldn't leave. So if we needed to go back to the US for something, like God forbid something happened to one of our parents or
Right.
siblings or something, we could have left, but we would have had a hell of a time getting back. And then it was getting close to summertime, and we knew that none of the airlines would fly bulldogs between usually it's the
Right.
end of May
Hmm.
and the end of October. And so at the beginning of May, we just decided, hey, I know that we put all this time and effort into coming here, and it would be awful to just undo everything. But we need to make a decision one way or the other. And we just decided basically within 24 hours, I called Lufthansa, found a flight that they could get us and the dogs back to Los Angeles. And we packed up everything, closed all our bank accounts, got COVID shots, took the dogs to get health exams, gave a bunch of stuff away to friends, closed our bank accounts, closed our rental account, and we're out of the place within 24 hours.
Wow.
It was, I don't know, it wasn't the greatest 24 hours, but it all's well that ends well. And we're here now, and I'm peering over here looking at my pup sleeping on his dog bed, looking out over the oceans. Yeah, it all worked out in the end.
The one surprise emotionally.
Oh, that's a good question. One surprise emotionally. There are days where, especially if you're somewhere where you don't speak the language, that it's just going to be really tough for you because you're just going to get so frustrated because you're not going to understand why something isn't working. And when you try to explain it in broken whatever, broken French, broken Spanish, broken German, whatever, and somebody tells you you need to do XYZ, and you think to yourself, I did XYZ. That's what I just told you I did. That's a hard enough conversation to have in English, but when you're having
Right.
it in a second language, sometimes it can be really tough. It was literally just last week, I was at the customs office. Nothing too important, but they were telling me I needed to do XYZ so that I wouldn't have to pay customs duties on a replacement fan because I had already paid customs for the fan that came in
Right.
that was broken, which is why I was getting a second one. And they were like, you need to pay customs for this. I'm like, am I going to pay customs twice? I already paid the customs. Here's what it is. And I was trying to explain to them what it was, and they were trying to explain to me why what I was explaining wasn't good, and we weren't getting it. We were talking past one another, and it was very emotionally frustrating, and you just want to bang your head against the wall. Now, granted, that's a problem specifically that I can do something about. I can learn better Spanish, and I'm in the process of doing that. But I think it's fair to say that most people, most Americans at least, when they move abroad, are not going to be fluent in the language of the country that they're moving to. I think that's probably the exception, not the rule.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Justin Burns. Justin, thanks so much for coming on this bonus episode of Amateur Traveler and talking about your experience with moving abroad. I imagine we didn't solve everybody's questions for all the different situations, but hopefully we gave some people an idea of what's going on.
Yeah, it's been great to be back. And I know you usually ask this on or called the main podcast, but I actually do have a entry on my webpage that I
Oh, okay.
discuss everything that transpired with my visa process and the move process from the first time around, from all of the good to all of the bad and everything in between.
Oh,
So that's
cool.
on
Send me
there.
that link and we'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, definitely will do.
Thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks. Talk to you soon.
I hope you're enjoying these episodes, these more travel episodes. Again, if you've got a better name for these series of episodes, let me know. I'm looking for suggestions. And I'm also looking for suggestions of what you'd like covered in these extra episodes. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.